Hello and welcome to round two of the MotoGP season. Joining me as always as my co-host is Rhys for today's MotoGP Extra podcast. Now, after round one, we had everything from bad stewarding to heavy crashes, bad track conditions, amazing overtaking, some crazy sprint race action. Coming to Argentina, we expected some of the same, and including a bit more weather and some more drama. So, as always, we're going to start with the lightweights class. Rhys, take it away, Moto 3. What did you think of the junior class in Argentina?
It was quite refreshing in a way because it was slightly different than what you usually get. To be fair, it was actually a closer race than I expected because I saw it was obviously raining when I switched on the warm up this afternoon for once because usually it is the morning, but afternoon since it was Argentina. And I thought, you know what, we could get a race here where it's just like one guy out front and then maybe like two behind him and just sort of massive gaps between them. But there was a bit of a pack at the front, but obviously not the usual Moto 3. But it is nice to see a little bit less random chaos with the overtakes. It actually wasn't far off a dry race, though, to be honest. So it wasn't quite what I expected, but it was good to see a different style of race, I must say. Some great rides throughout the field, so I'm sure we'll be getting into some different riders, what they did right and what they did wrong.
Yeah, I must say, usually in Moto 3, when you get a wet race or a mixed condition race, you usually end up with your kind of front three who are like in different league, 7, 8, 10, 12 seconds up the road. Then you have a pack in the kind of top 10, and then you have another pack towards the back of the field. But it was a bit different today for Argentina. Um, it is worth noting in the dry, no grip, dirty track. Track was in very bad condition, but in the wet, the track was incredibly running so fast. It was really really strange. But we're going to jump in now with Honda. Struggled a small bit in Portimao after a good showing in pre-season. What did you make of the few Hondas in the top 10 in Moto 3?
To be honest, I kind of think it's just a bit of a fluke, just because of the rain. If I'm completely honest, I don't think they particularly were that quick in the dry sessions that they did have. Obviously, in Portimao again, they weren't great. It's okay, like it's not that bad, but you can just see it's not the package to be on. If you want to win the championship, if you want to fight for the championship, I still think you need to be on a KTM. It had looked like in pre-season they'd made a bit of a step forward, but I think KTM were running sort of older engines in their bikes, and apparently the Honda is very consistent with the amount of power it puts out. You know, the brand new engine puts out pretty much the same power as an engine that's been used for like a whole season. In the end, obviously it fails, but with KTM, it seems like you get a lot more power at the beginning of a new engine, and it gradually decreases. So I think in testing they were just using old engines because it's not worth taking the strain out of the engines. Whereas in Honda, yes, you can use old engines, but you get the same amount of power as you do out of a new one. So I think that masks the Honda a little bit. Obviously, the Leopard team, they're always pretty strong. It was sort of the two Leopards were pretty strong for most of the race. Obviously, we'll get onto both of those riders later. Masia, of course, wasn't so strong by the end. Scott Ogden was up there as well on the Honda. Ricky Rossi as well. I think the rest of the pack were KTMs, so I think it probably is a bit of a fluke. Also, it's worth noting that the Leopard boys were very strong there last year. Foggia and Suzuki were pretty good at Argentina, so it probably does play to the Honda bike's strength a little bit more, the corner speed of some of the sections. But yeah, I don't think you'd expect to see this going forward. I think the KTM will remain the stronger bike, just maybe if you get wet conditions, the Honda might be able to be a bit closer again.
Yeah, I agree with the. I think the track itself does suit Honda. More corner speed. Traditionally, the Moto 3 class KTM is the power, is the kind of the Ducati, we could say. And then the Honda is more like the Yamaha corner speed, braking a bit earlier. So usually in the wet condition, you kind of want to have your decent corner speed. You don't want a really peaky engine where a lot of wheel spin and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see when we get to Europe to see what the way the field lies out in terms of KTM versus Honda. Obviously, it's not going to be a huge gap, but last year there was some gaps in the field where you could visibly see the Honda just couldn't make the difference, even if they had quick riders and stuff. So happy for Honda, happy for the Leopard, and of course our winner Suzuki, who we'll jump on to now. So he wasn't the fastest throughout the race. In my notes here, I wrote down that because I remember thinking that someone would get to P2, they'd take a second out of him, and then they'd crash. Step up the next guy, do the same thing, and his gap was going slowly up but coming down rapidly. But because someone would crash, then we gain back another second in lieu. So must say, using his wise old head, he is there now a good few years, his third win in the class, and I've been pretty critical of Tatsuki Suzuki, especially last year when he got the Leopard ride, but in fairness, didn't put a foot wrong today. Fabulous win. What did you make of the Jops ride?
It was a bit of a surprise. Obviously, it was a little bit like Powie, a bit reminiscent of that. I know that's been made, the comparison's been made a few times with that one. Just sort of managed to pull away. And to be honest, Suzuki, he's always been a very fast rider. I just don't think he's particularly the best battler. So once he got to the front and he was able to just run his lines, he kind of just ran a pretty good, not the best pace out of everybody, but pretty consistent pace. And he probably could have gone faster if he wanted to, but we saw what happened if you tried to go faster. You ended up like Onshu, you ended up like Sasaki, you ended up, like the other riders that fell off trying to catch him up or trying to pull away from him. So I think ultimately, yes, maybe he didn't have the fastest lap of the race, but I think he was riding it fairly close to a decent limit, and he probably could have pushed further, but would have ended up crashing. So it kind of sums him up a bit in a way that, yes, he managed to win the race, but it was because he managed to get away. Sort of Almanza was being very aggressive behind, sort of held up some of the other pack, allowed him to get a bit of a break. Although, having said that, I have just said, of course, he did pull away and use his head. Suzuki tends to crash. Back on the Paolo Silvicelli days, he'd qualify sort of third place, sort of be a bit scrappy in the race and end up falling off. That happened a lot. Again, I guess that's because maybe he's not the best battler, best scrapper, but yeah, I don't know. It was a very good ride. It's the kind of ride you expect from someone that's been in the class as much as he has been, for as long as he has been, like you say. He's a very experienced rider. So yeah, it's the kind of thing you'd expect. Kind of thing you'd expect from his teammate, and his teammate fell off. So yeah, fair play to Suzuki. Can't really fault him this time. Like you say, we did have a lot to say about that Leopard ride last year. And again, there was some races where we're like, wow, he's earned that ride, and then other times it's like, that's a bit rubbish. So yeah, this round pretty good for Suzuki. Hopefully he can take the momentum, but like I said before, I can't see the Honda being particularly strong, although the Leopard, probably the only exception, probably will be able to just about keep up with that front pack of KTMs.
Yeah, Leopard being probably the most one or probably top two most experienced teams in the class. So you'd imagine if there's a weekend where experience will show, it will be the Leopard team. But just to finish off in Suzuki, I always think of Tatsuki as just a brilliant qualifier. So massive corner speed, getting the most out of one whole lap, but never be great in a race. So he's had so many pole positions in his career, and never really can do it on the Sunday unless he has a race like today where he's given 3-4 seconds and he can kind of do his own laps on his own. But in Moto 3, we all know it's just not how it goes, really. It's just completely different. But moving on now, you did mention David, the standing rider, David Asanda, I think his name is. Correct me if I'm wrong, I can't remember. Almanza, exactly, yeah. There's too many Spanish boys. But two stand-ins, Almanza and the
Mino.
old faithful small Pope Mino. Now, we must mention in the last podcast we didn't fully cover Joel Kelso. He's had a bad knock, will be out for probably the next couple of rounds. Obviously wasn't here this weekend. That's why he had our stand-in rider, and probably won't be there, we'd imagine, for Texas as of right now. That's kind of what the word is. So we will probably see a few more stand-ins in the next few weeks. And to be fair, two stand-ins, two sublime rides. What did you make of Mino and Amansa's in today's race?
Well, it was great, wasn't it? To be honest, I was actually quite happy to see Mino there because he was really good at the start of last year on the sniper's bike, and then just tailed off and just didn't do that great. But I think it is sort of a flaw with, obviously, the Honda itself. Like, the Honda just isn't there anymore. So if you're a decent rider on a Honda, especially if you're the old school rider, that's not, necessarily like these young guys, a bit like Mino, a bit like Fanati, who was pretty weak the last couple of races. I don't think it really works for you over the season. It works at some rounds and not others. But to see him on a KTM, it was suddenly back up there. So I think it does show that Mino probably still deserves a seat in this paddock. It's a shame, really, that there is the age limit, because I don't know how old Mino is off the top of my head, but he's been around for a long, long time. So he's got to be getting up there towards that age limit, sort of the John McPhee type of rider that's getting towards that point. But it was a great ride from him, obviously standing in for Lorenzo Fallon, who has got some issues with his shoulder. It keeps dislocating, a bit like Marc Marquez's did back in 2019. So he's had to have surgery on that, so he's out for a little bit. But it was a great ride from him. It was pretty fast all weekend, to be fair, as well. It wasn't just the fact that it was wet that put him up there. He got himself straight through into Q2, even off the back of FP1, which was dry, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, he had a great weekend, Mino did. Raced very cleverly, managed to get that podium in the end. I'm really happy for him. Almanza, on the other hand, again, fantastic weekend. really trying to prove himself. Obviously, Mino, he's been there, done that. People know how good he is roughly. He's probably, reaffirmed that. So I would be very surprised if we didn't see him turn up on a couple of other bikes during this season. I would say he's probably going to stand in until full on is back, and then maybe stand in elsewhere throughout the season. But Almanza, he's a young rider, so he's got to try and prove himself to get a full time ride. And to be fair, off the basis of this race, I would say that you'd be pretty silly to not sign him up. I would say BOE probably, would probably want to look at him, to be honest, because they've already got Munoz, who's a very aggressive rider, and their other riders really not performing. So maybe for next season they might be looking at Almanza. I don't know, but Almanza it was a great ride, to be fair. Very aggressive, but that's just what you get with these junior GP guys now. It's a bit aggressive. Maybe tone that down a bit, but again, he was trying to make a point, I guess, to an extent. So I guess, he's going to be a bit more aggressive. Never been to the track before as well, so phenomenal ride. And I felt really sorry for him when he got knocked off at the end, because yes, he'd been aggressive throughout the race, but he didn't deserve that. He hadn't knocked anybody off or anything, so it really was a shame for him.
Yeah, I agree with Amanta. It's so unfortunate how his race ended in the end. He was really showing some pace, and he's another Spanish rider that's come up through the ranks, and you just think, Jesus, where do they get these kids? Like, they're just so quick onto a track he's never seen, wet conditions, a bike that he's not been on before, and he's battling in and around the podium. And to be honest, I was disgusted what happened to him. I really wasn't happy with it. Obviously, it was a mistake from Scott Ogden, but we'll come to him later as we have something to say. Well, I definitely have something to say about him towards the end of the Motor 3 section. But in fairness to him, Almenza, brilliant job. Definitely could see him on the grid in the next, maybe even this year, if things go right. If, like you mentioned, the CIP ride, if potentially someone loses a seat. If you look at Fanati last year, midway through, not even midway through, the first like 5 rounds, 6 rounds in, he got lost his job, and they pulled Alonso in. So it could be something similar like that. Definitely shows pace, very level-headed. He seemed very good in the battle, and yeah, I definitely could see him on the grid. But we are going to move now on to Anshu. Now, at the start of the race, he was interviewed. He was so calm, was ready. You'd imagine that, again, another rider, another bit of experience. You thought maybe this is his day. Lap 1, he was mental. Rhys, what did you make of his race? For me, mind-blowingly stupid.
Yeah, I can't really say anything else than that. It was mind-blowingly stupid. It was just so aggressive on the first lap, which he was dive bombing people like he would in the dry. Like, okay, fair enough. There was lots of grip that had just been shown in warm-up beforehand, and I think he was aware of that, so he was pushing the limits a bit because of that. But he was going for moves that were so close to people, running wide at every corner because he's braking so late and then running wide. It's like, in the rain, you're just asking to crash at that point. He was being so aggressive. I mean, even in the dry, you'd be saying, what are you doing, mate? You're just dive bombing people at every corner. It's like somebody in an online game, right? It's like someone in GP bikes. It's like someone in the MotoGP game that just dive bombs you at every corner to try and keep in front of you. And I just don't know really what he was doing. Eventually got to the front. Clearly that's what he wanted to do. And fair enough, he did get to the front. He overtook people. He didn't knock anybody off, so I guess I'm not going to be too harsh on him for that. The moves were a bit weird and a bit too aggressive, I thought, but fair enough. He didn't actually knock anybody off or anything, so I guess that's fine. But then once he got into the lead, he was just pushing so hard. Yes, in a way, that's sometimes the kind of right thing to do. If you're feeling comfortable with the conditions, keep going. You don't want to slow down because that's sometimes when you crash. And oftentimes in these wet races, like we alluded to at the beginning, you do get these runaway victors like Powie, other riders like that. Fanati's done it in the past. You see this in these mixed conditions. And I assume that's what he was trying to do, and I assume he was trying to keep the heat in the tyres. But based on that first lap, he was riding so ragged, way over the limit. And when it cut to him in the gravel, I don't think a single person was surprised. And yeah, why do that? Because ultimately, he's fighting for his a championship this year. Okay, his first round wasn't ideal, but we praised him for the way he rode. He stalled the bike, made a mistake, or whatever. If the team made a mistake, I don't know exactly what happened, but he did a good race on the pit lane, got some decent points, and ultimately, he's on a KTM. He's in the factory KTM team. A rider with a decent amount of experience now should be not making these mistakes, should be fighting for the championship, and in a wet race, decides to be really aggressive, crashes out. I think he then... Did he retire at the end? Because I saw him get back on, and then we never saw him catch anybody again, which would be surprising in a wet race that he hadn't caught anybody up. So I don't know if he then
I never
retired.
saw him retire, but I know he kept going for a small period. But I don't know after a while because they didn't
Yeah, they
focus
never
back on him.
showed him, and I didn't see his name ever come back up the tower. And there was enough crashes where you would assume he would have done, or like you didn't see him come through when you were like watching Messiah in the gravel or whatever. So yeah, I'm not sure, but either way, he scored no points. Uh, I just yeah, great job at the second round of the season to. I guess not three championship away because it is Moto 3. Everyone's gonna have DNFs, but this could have been a race where he could have picked up good points if he'd just kept his head and been careful.
Yeah, again, Anshu, a bit hot-headed. As I look at the results here, he actually, by the look of it, he does actually make the finish.
Did he really?
But yeah, he was the last of the finishers, a minute and a half down. So P24. So he did actually make the finish in fairness to him, but
Perhaps he
that
took
point
longer
damage
to
was
get
done.
going than we thought. Then
Yeah. Also, as well, it was pretty fast crash, so I'd imagine there was. I'd say deep down he probably was gutted at like he made so many mistakes, then crashed. He probably just didn't want to go back to the pits. I can't really blame him
yeah,
after being so kind of idiotic in the start. Like the fact I again no, I agree that if you're in your own pace, you can stick to that, and that's what you should. But like he was running wide everywhere. He was going deep in everywhere. He was all over the track. He wasn't like being consistent. So it's not like that. He passed a couple of people in the opening lap, gapped them in the last sector, and then just started taking 3/10 every lap out of him. He was, you could see he was ragged. It was like a qualifying lap every lap for him, and it's only a matter of time. We all kind of was expecting it, to be honest, and um, still a bit of immaturity really from someone who's in a serious team this year and definitely has a chance of the championship. But I did mention earlier Scott Ogden, um, the incident with the stand-in rider. I cannot believe his post-race interview. Um, First off, he came into the pits. I've a lot wrong with this. I before today's race, I had no bias towards or against um Scott. I said in kind of our group chat during the race that he had made a step in pre-season and he looked this year a better rider. Makes a mistake. Fair enough, everybody makes a mistake. It was similar to Marcus. He does lock the front and then has to release the brake, and in fairness, kind of runs into him. The fact he come into the pit is celebrating, no sign of remorse, then has the guile to go on live national TV that will be broadcast all around the world and blame the guy he knocked off for being an idiot and saying, well, oh, well, oh, throughout the race they were stupid idiots, and he kind of got what was coming to him. I know that you can't get a penalty, but I would be giving him a back of the grid start for that, just for what he said, calling the other riders he was racing idiots after he T-boning someone by outbraking themselves by a mile. Ridiculous. I'm absolutely fuming him. I completely have no respect for him after that. Rhys did remind me before the podcast started that last year he came out and basically said his team was shit, which is outrageous considering they've given him the start in GB and they've given him a great platform with the MLAV Academy and just everything that the new team has gone through. I just I kind of liked him before because I kind of felt like he was a hard worker and he was trying, but the attitude today after that and just the fact that no apology, fair enough if you believe that deep down, that's great. I guarantee some of the best riders have believed it, but when you're going on TV, you must show respect to your opponent, show respect for your team. The fact that he didn't just suck it up and go, look, I made a mistake. I'm really sorry to you. It was a small mistake on my behalf. Really, not much I could do. I really apologise to the lad, and I hope it doesn't happen again. He came out and called him stupid for his race. Reece, I'm very interested to get your opinion because I know I'm a bit more hot-headed than you, but for me, absolutely ridiculous from him.
it just seems like a very strange comment to make. Like I thought the exact same thing. Like I wasn't so bothered that he was kind of happy after the race because I guess I could look at it from his point of view that like he had a good race, he's got his best ever result. Okay, he made a mistake and he feels bad for knocking somebody. Well, clearly he doesn't really feel that bad about it, but before he said that, so maybe he feels a bit bad about knocking the other guy off, but he's still happy. And ultimately, he got given his penalty, so I guess in a way, like he's got his fifth place or whatever it was, sixth place, and that's his best result. But then it just what I don't know why he said it. Like, why did he not just apologize? Even if he did think that they were riding like idiots and aggressive throughout the race, which, in fairness, they were very aggressive, but they didn't knock anybody off. Like I said earlier when I was talking about Armance, he was aggressive but fair. He didn't knock anybody off. I mean, the only bit of contact that was really that bad, well, wasn't actually bad, but there was a penalty given for it, was the one with Sasaki and Almansa, which, again, I don't know how he got a penalty for that, but there you go. Ogden, got a deserved penalty. I don't know why he decided to say that because it just made him look like an idiot. Like you said, I don't know why he said that these other guys were really aggressive, so he kind of deserved it. He should have just put his hands up and say, "Yeah, sorry, I made a mistake." There was a lot of aggression throughout the race anyway, but yeah, it was really unfortunate to end another guy's race. But on the bright side, I had a good race, whatever. To say it like that, I don't know why he, decided to say, "Oh yeah, this guy's an idiot." So he's not bothered that he knocked him off. Just strange and unneeded comment.
So we are moving on now to Moto 2. Now Moto 2 was shortened because they had zero wet rodding practice or any qualifying session throughout the weekend. So it was shortened by a few laps. So coming into it, we really didn't know what to expect because Moto 2, first time this season in the wet, they had a small bit of wet testing in Portimao, but a lot of riders decided not to go out in it. So it was a real lottery. So when Arbolino got to the front late on, we weren't really surprised Rhys I after his performances throughout last season, especially in some wet conditions.
No, it actually wasn't too much of a surprise. He's kind of become a bit of a rain man, almost just any conditions where it's a bit slippery. Because if you remember back to his first Moto2 victory last year was in Austin with the very strange surface. We had two or three race leaders crash out in front of him, but he just kept a cool head during those conditions. He was also, amazing in Sepang, if you remember. Iagora threw away his entire championship campaign trying to beat Arbolino at that circuit. So just seems when the grip is low, Arbolino is fast. I mean, he's also fast when the grip is high as well, it seems. If you remember back to Portimao, he was P3 there, but he seems virtually unstoppable in the rain or just the low conditions, so not a surprise at all to see him there. Becoming clinical, and I must say, it's looking bad for his teammate because his teammate, again, wasn't having a great weekend, and Arbolino, once again, doing something fantastic. So I think Arbolino really has put himself down now as a championship contender. He's actually leading the championship, in fact, now, isn't he? But I think if you had any questions over him before, there definitely isn't any now. I mean, I don't think there was any questions over him anyway. The way he ended last season, the way he started this one, were good enough anyway. But another win on the books just shows once again when the grip is low, when the conditions are tricky, he rises to the occasion, no matter who he's against. Even an on-form Acosta was absolutely nowhere near him. Arbolino battling Lopez again, another rider that will be up there in the championship fight. So yeah, great race from Arbolino.
Yeah, brilliant from Arbolino. You do mention Acosta. Achilles heel in the wet, maybe? What you reckon? Weather is not his forte?
I'm not sure really, because if you remember back to his 2021 campaign in Moto3, he had some of his best rides were in the rain. Le Mans 2021, he did crash in that race, but he then remounted to finish 8th, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. If you remember, one of the Austrias, I can't remember if it was Austria or Styria.
Styria.
Him and Garcia were miles ahead of everybody else in the wet, and he pushed Garcia into a mistake, and Garcia crashed on the last lap. I think Acosta was leading already, if I'm not mistaken.
He
But
went for an overtake, lost the front, and then Garcia high-sided.
yes,
It was
that's what happened.
madness.
Yeah, yeah. But either way, again, I don't think he's necessarily bad in the wet conditions. I can't really remember about how well he fared in the Moto2 races though last year in the rain because he missed so much of the season. I can't remember, where he was just absent completely or where he was just absent in terms of performance. So I don't know. Maybe in these bigger categories, it's an Achilles heel. But again, it's also worth noting. I think he's only been to Termas once before as well. So it's the track is still new for him. Maybe the wet conditions were a bit of a struggle for him, but he did start to come through towards the end. He dropped really far down to begin with and sort of came back through to pick up a few points. But yeah, it did seem like a weak race for him, which again I'm not 100% sure how good he is in the wet, but from what I remember from the Moto3 season, it was pretty good. So yeah, it is a bit strange to see.
Could be the fact he's just inexperienced on a Moto 2 bike in the wet because you do mention a couple of good rides there in Moto 3 in the wet and bigger bike, heavier, more power, completely different animal in the wet. So maybe it's just the fact that he's not as confident in the wet conditions under the current category he's in. And to be fair, it is amazing if you think how fast they get up to speed in them classes and never mind trying wet weather at them. So again, you mentioned he's only been to the track twice. There's a lot of things really pointing towards why Acosta wasn't on the at the forefront of the field this weekend. But not to worry, he's going to have plenty of good weekends. We still all kind of imagine that it's going to be a pretty whitewash of a season for him, but it still shows that he is human. There's mistakes in him. There is weekends where he's probably not going to be prime Rossi or prime Lorenzo. Like he's going to have weekends where he will struggle with the bike and the setup. So
He
it's good to
stayed on
see
though, so
that
that
it's
was important.
exactly, and that's for someone who's so young and not experienced in that class. It's brilliant that he still brought home some sort of points towards. But someone who also stayed on, did very well after crashing out last weekend was Lopez. Now, Lopez came into the class last year so well. The Bosco score last year was quite well. We believe this year, from what we can tell, the Cadillacs have made a step, and we reckon that the two Lopez and Aldeguer have just kind of dropped back slowly. But good race today. You wouldn't usually think of the Bosco score as a wet weather bike because it's usually stiffer, which is probably the opposite of what you want in the wet. But what did you make of young Lopez's race today?
It was more what I expected of him from this season. Obviously, he had a great season last season. It was great. He came in midway through the season, pretty much was consistently fast in every race. You know, he was up there. Had he been there the whole season, he would have been, a title contender for sure. Because I imagine second half of the season he was probably top point scorer. I'd be very surprised if he wasn't. So you drop him in earlier on in the season from the beginning, give him a proper pre-season, potentially he wins that championship, and because of the way they were so inconsistent, probably maybe he doesn't win, but he at least fights for it. So this is kind of what we expected from him. A bit out of form last week, but he wasn't terrible last week. He was still running in like the top 10, I think, but then he picked up a penalty, did his double long lap, then he was sort of outside the top 10, a bit further down, and then he crashed, I think, probably pushing too hard. So it was a scrappy weekend from last weekend, but generally that's what you get in Moto 2. And you also have to remember these guys, there's a reason why they're in Moto 2, then Moto 3, then Moto 2, because they're still learning as they go on. They're not the complete riders. So yeah, he had a bit of a bad weekend in the first one, but this is more what I expected from him. Again, I can't really think about how good he was in the wet, but he's shown that he obviously is pretty decent. The Bosco Sciuro does work here. Obviously, we saw that with Aldeguer last year. Shame that Aldeguer didn't seem to show that performance again this year. I just don't know what's happened to him. He just completely dropped off a cliff, basically, since this round last year. It's very, very bizarre. But yeah, Lopez, great race, really. Unfortunate for him to lose out in the end to Arbolino because he led for so long, then just kept getting wider and wider at like turn 6 every lap, and then in the end he lost the position and he wasn't able to get it back. So yeah, pretty good ride from him. It's kind of the championship ride. And with Acosta not scoring too well, it almost makes up for the fact that he didn't score in the previous race. They've both had a bad weekend now. It's Arbolino is the one that's had the two good weekends, but I'm sure there'll be a point where he has, a bit of an off weekend. Everybody gets it in Moto 2. So yeah, I don't think the first round's anything to worry about, maybe a blip. This is kind of more, I think, what we'll expect to see from him for the rest of the year.
Yeah, and it just was a good solid weekend. And again, a lot of people doubted him after having such a good season last year. Coming into this year, everyone was kind of going, well, he should walk the season after his last year, and then got to round one, struggled, had the crash, and then people started to talk. And to be fair, came here, got to the front, and put in a solid race. And you did mention turn 5. I actually think he was going wide to avoid the actual dry line, because usually the racing line in the wet is like everywhere off the dry line, because the dry line is rubbered and that becomes like ice. So you want to kind of stay off it. So you'll see a lot of times they won't be right out to the white line, and they'll turn in a bit early. They'll go slightly deep just to cut across it while the bike is upright and come back. So that's what I think he was doing. But then he seemed to be making more mistakes and going even further wide than that. So then he started to just seem inconsistent. So it's a bit strange, since the first lap he was behind Arbolino. He did the exact same line as Arbolino. So I
Yeah,
think
he
he just
followed him
needed
straight away.
maybe he just needed some sort of marker. But overall, strong result from him, and it's a good way now to kind of kickstart the season and push on from here. But someone who hasn't made a great start and who had a good chance today at getting his first win, Canet, costly mistake getting the jump start. Had a good race nonetheless, but 2 long lap penalties is just a bit too much in modern racing. What did you think of Aaron Canet's race?
Yeah, it was quite a big mistake, wasn't it? Really, because it's one of those things where when you get the penalty for the jump start, if it's one of those ones where the wheel is rolling just a little bit, or you've just made a bit of movement like we've seen in the past, Cal Crutchlow at this very track is a good example of that. You kind of like, oh, that's a bit harsh, but this was a proper old school jump start. Like he was going before the lights went out. I didn't even notice it at the time. Like it's not as bad as it seems. Like it's probably like 0.2, 0.3 of a second or something, but definitely an advantage. You saw how much when they showed the replay how early he went compared to everybody else. So fair penalty, but obviously a bit of a costly mistake. Did his 2 long laps, but honestly, he didn't lose that much time from them. I mean, he was immediately back up into like P5 or P4 straight away after he'd done them because he basically was obviously running what, like, was it like P2 when he took the first one? Dropped in sort of behind Manu Gonzalez and Darren Binder, that group of riders. Basically, immediately passed them, did the long lap, came out again alongside Manu Gonzalez, and in the same way overtook him, and then overtook Darren Binder and was straight back up into fourth. And he was a bit behind them all, but he then didn't really catch them. So I don't think he had the pace anyway. I think in those first couple of laps he definitely did, but I think that might have almost just been a bit of red mist because he knew he'd jumped the start. I mean, he would have known when you've done it by that much, you would know you've done it. It's not like when you come round, you're like, oh, double long lap, what did I get that for? Like, he definitely knew he jumped the start. So, yeah, perhaps just pushing in those first couple of laps to make up for that. And then once he actually got back in that position, if he'd kept that pace on, would have caught that lead group easily, but they upped their pace then, and he didn't really have the pace to match them.
Yeah, it was just a small, like, again, probably very nervous in a wet race. Your first time out in the wet all season. You haven't done any laps in the wet. Just a bit of nerves, probably just a little twitch, and that was his race done really. But in fairness, a good recovery ride after the 2 penalties. They do well to get back to a solid point scoring position. But other than that, it was a pretty dull-ish race, to be honest. It wasn't one of those amazing, like if you think back to it was Thailand last year when it really bucketed down. There was so much overtaking, a lot of crashes, there was so much action everywhere. But today, just a bit on the dull side for a wet race. I think a lot of people had not much rain practice done and kind of just weren't too up to speed in the wet because I could see a lot of people just taking it kind of a bit more cautious than you expect. So the race was a bit kind of a train, but still, there was some good action at the front, but we are now going to move to the MotoGP sprint. Now, we had our first one last week. We loved it. It was crazy. We loved it and hated it for different reasons. What did you make of the sprint overall today in Argentina?
I'm still not really sure about them, to be honest. Again, obviously it was very strange. Not quite as chaotic as the previous one, but in a way it still was. I mean, I just remember the image of them on the back straight down towards like it's either turn 5 or 6. I don't know what it's classed as because of the kinks and stuff on the straights, but down towards that corner, you know which one I mean. And they were just fanned out along the straight, and it was like a Moto3 race. It is crazy, like it is insane because MotoGP is so close, and in the races, the thing that makes the difference is basically everyone has to conserve the tyres to some extent. Some people just are better at doing that and can push more and things like that, or they've got, you know, a certain tyre that suits the weekend. But basically, when you're in the sprint race, everyone's on a really soft tyre. Everyone's going flat out straight away, and because the margins are so close, it's almost effectively decided like immediately. Like it's so important that the start is like immediately, and they just say in one bunch. And as impressive it is to watch, it's very scary to watch when they're in like a big pack like that. You've got like a load of massively fast MotoGP bikes all like sort of fanning out down this straight, and it's like, whoa, what's going to happen here? Because someone gets it wrong, that's going to be a big, a bit of bowling. But yeah, again, it was good. It's still a little bit tense to watch, and it feels a little bit random almost in a way as well. With what happens, but then some of the better riders from that race also performed in the main race as well. So maybe it is a bit more representative of the weekend performance than it first seems.
To be honest, I'm actually sold on it. I really enjoyed both of them. I loved the overtaking. I loved the aggression. Now I am still worried because it's so close, like you said, and at any moment something could happen. And you increase the amount of race starts, you increase the amount of opening sectors and opening laps. You imagine there's going to be more people hurt throughout the season, and it just worries me what could happen still. But I actually really enjoy this format now at the moment of having a sprint race of a Saturday. It's not a long race. It's it's funny, right? Because it still is quite a decent. It's not 3 laps. They ride as if it's like a lap and a half to the finish.
Yeah, but it's
They
still
have like
50%.
12.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it
There's
was
still
only two
plenty of
laps less
time.
than the whole Moto2 race.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. It's like they put the word sprint in it and they just go, yeah, let's just send it into turn one and see what happens. Like it's just still time to make overtakes, but everyone gets so worked up that everyone is it's crazy, and I do enjoy it, but
It's because the tyre drop
just
off is gone. So if you lose time on the
yeah.
first lap, you can't make it back up because people's tyres don't run out.
Yeah, 100%. There's so much panic and like nervousness about it, but so far as a consumer of it, and it is very entertaining. But we're going to go into detail now. Ballsy Binder, Brad Binder, what a start! Take it away.
Yeah, I just don't know how he does it. Like he does this every so often. He doesn't do it every race, don't get me wrong, but he just sometimes does it. He starts absolutely nowhere. You're just watching the leaders in turn one, like you're watching like I was watching Morbidelli to be honest, because we'll get onto him later, but yeah, it was great to see him at the front. And his start was unbelievable as well, in both races. It was really good. Like actually the launch of the line. So I was watching him, and all of a sudden Brad Binder's like P4. It's like I couldn't remember off the top of my head where he qualified, but I knew he didn't get through into Q2, so he'd at least come from outside the top 12. Like I just it was an unbelievable start, and it shows the sprint race like the start and the qualifying are the most important parts of that race because there's no tyre drop off. And yes, all right, there's still a 50% race, but it's not that much time to make up time. If you get a good start and you can pick people off and you can be aggressive, you can hold it because obviously we didn't get to see him in the main race, but I think had it, in the main race, I don't think he's winning, even if it's dry. And he also probably doesn't go for that either into turn one. But yeah, it was great. You've got to there is an element of luck to it. The riders got to split in the right way, but also you've got to have the talent to make the most of it. You've got to have the talent to go that deep into the corner, go up the inside of everybody, and it was insane. And then all of a sudden he was just overtaking. Like he wasn't like he passed everyone to turn one. He still had to make a few more overtakes. Past Alex Marquez, past Morbidelli. I think he passed Bezecchi as well. So yeah, it was a great race from Binder. And he just held on at the end there in front of Bezecchi as well. Just managed to hold on.
Yeah, it was so good, and he wrote such a defensive race when he had to, and his race was two halves really. He had the opening where lunged into turn one, made up so many positions, being brave and taking risks, being clean, then picked off a few riders, got to the front, had a good pace, but then of course as Ducatis got into their stride and stuff, he did get pegged back, but he did pretty much everything right. He defended where he needed to defend it. He was quick where he needed to be quick, and just got it to the line. And I was delighted for him because they've had some tough moments, KTM, and it looks like maybe now, touch wood, they're coming out of the little hole they've been in for a few years because they really have worked so hard and they've thrown so many chassis and so many different aero fairings and swing arms and engines and God knows how much money they've spent. And now we had Miller at the front in Portimao in the race and the sprint. We had Miller towards the front in the race, but of course then we had Binder win the sprint. So hats off to KTM for finally maybe looking like they're on the way back to probably where they should be, which is the top of the sport. And Binder, well, I'm a huge fan of Binder. Have been back since his maiden win in Jerez when he came from last. I think it was 2016 in Jerez on the KTM. I've been a big fan of him throughout his career. I love his style. I love his just everything about him. I really like the guy, and I do like seeing him do well. And it's a shame that he does usually qualify 16th, and he usually finishes 7th, and he makes up so many positions. But this weekend, managed to do it slightly better than he normally does, and I was delighted for him. So hats off to him. But we are going to move on now to someone you've already mentioned, Frankie Morbidelli, another rider. He's probably one of my favorite riders. I just everything about Frankie. I love the kind of colourful character and the colourful numbers, lovely helmet, and when he burst into the scene in Motor 2, really really took a liking to him. And then got into GP, had a tough year with the Mark VES, tough couple of seasons there, and then when he got onto the Yamaha, looked like he found his match, found a good competitive bike. Seemed like he rode it a bit like Rossi. Seemed like he had that kind of understanding of how to go quick in the bike, and then it just had that knee injury, and everything since then has been bad. And there's just been so many people saying, how does Frankie still have a seat in GP? He shouldn't be even in BSB, and it's just so many rubbish things come out of him. And I'm so happy that he's shut a lot of people up this weekend by not only getting straight into Q2, qualifying fourth, getting 2 race starts and leading both races, and leading a lot of the sprint race. What did you make of Frankie's return to form, and what do you think that means for the rest of his season and Yamaha?
Well, Frankie Morbidelli has finally turned up for the first time since Jerez 2021. I just don't know. It makes no sense, and it's great to see. Like I was so happy to see him up there because we've had it over the last year and a half, ever since he jumped on, ever since he had the knee injury, like you say, and then of course he came back from that injury straight onto the factory Yamaha because of what had happened with Vinales and all the different things there. So he's been on the factory Yamaha since halfway through 21, and we've not seen much. We've seen him in some free practice sessions occasionally, like an FP1. He's been up there, and it's like, oh, Morbidelli might be good this weekend. Or a lot of the times in FP4, he's looked pretty good. Obviously, FP4 is not a thing anymore, but in the past when it was, he's looked pretty good throughout there. But then he's never qualified very well. He's never got through into Q2. He's never been that good in the race. He's kind of got stuck. And I just thought it was going to be the same again. Like, I saw him do well. I was like, oh, Fabio's struggling a bit in FP1, but Morbidelli's done pretty good. And oh, Morbidelli's gone through to Q2. That's a surprise. Well, he'll probably qualify 12th anyway. Oh, Morbidelli's got 4th somehow. That's amazing. Let's see what he does now. Like, I just kept thinking throughout the weekend, like, oh, he's kind of done this before. He's kind of done this before, but he's shown some signs. Even on the grid at the sprint race, I thought, how many laps till he's behind Quartararo? But he didn't. Once I saw him off the start, and once I saw him for a couple of laps and leading the race, I was like, he really seems to have found something this weekend. I don't know whether it's just it must be just a mental thing. Like riders are very like I don't want to say the word fickle because I feel like sometimes it's a bit of a sounds a bit insulting, but they are like in a way like especially Vinales as well as similar. But it seems like as soon as he had a good free practice. The conditions, he outdid Quartararo. Oh, I'm doing good this weekend. He goes into qualifying. The conditions are a bit weird, and he kind of puts a good lap together. He qualifies 4th. He just starts to believe in himself again. Gets a great start, leads for a bit. Also, the sprint, worth noting, that Yamaha actually isn't that bad on the straights anymore, is it? It was keeping those Ducatis behind for quite a while. It was very surprising. The top end is there. It's just the acceleration isn't there. So off a fast corner onto the straight, which we have here, he was actually able to keep more Marini behind for quite a while. So Morbidelli, it was just great to see him. And I just kept expecting at some point of the weekend it'll fall apart. But it didn't. He actually held it together. And I must say, I was so disappointed that he didn't get on the podium. I was so disappointed he didn't get on the podium. But hopefully this is finally Morbidelli returning because it's been so long since we've seen him.
Yeah, you make a great point about the Yamaha. I was very intrigued as well because Yamaha have always been kind of good in the short straights. They get out of the corner well, but of late, even the corners that they used to get out of well and have that kind of run, they don't even have that anymore. So the fact that Marini was pulling out a slipstream and just going nowhere alongside Frankie on the M1, I was so happy for that because they obviously have flaws elsewhere, but the fact that they're now competing in the last 100, 200 meters on the straight and they're not just being caught and made look ridiculous like they used to for so many years. It's just, if they can tidy up the electronics, get a bit more rear grip, they have a solid bike there. They have a bike that turns. You'll be able to overtake with that top end. No question. No, it's not going to be as easy as a Ducati, but if you're what we would think Fabio is probably the best rider in the world, maybe top 3, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt that he's in the top 3 of the last 18 months to 2 years after his title. Frankie, I'd put him in the top 6, top 7. Now, a lot of people probably think that's too high, but from what I saw through Moto2, his couple of years in GP, I think he's one of the best. Unfortunately, the injury, lack of form, just Yamaha direction going. Like, remember towards the end of Valentino's career, the direction of Yamaha really just went away from him. It just wasn't what he could ride and what was good for him. Morbidelli is kind of a carbon copy of Valentino. And the fact that the bike is getting only more and more towards Fabio, it kind of was always going to be this way. So the fact it's come back, I still have my doubts that he's not going to kick on now and be what he was in 2020. I still believe deep down that if he scores a top 10 the next race, it will be a fantastic result. But again, he was so close to the podium, and I could see Zarco coming, and I was just thinking, oh, but if Zarco passes him, maybe he'll have a battle with Marquez and he can kind of jump him, because he was keeping Alex Marquez honest for a lot of the race, and in the main race, I really thought that maybe things might go his way. And when Pecco decided to exit stage left, he was on the podium. It was looking like it, but unfortunately, he was just a bit shy. But it'll do wonders for his own mental health, his own belief in himself, his confidence. So hopefully, moving forward, we will see the number 21 up towards the sharp end more oftenly. But we're going to move on now to his teammate in the sprint. Fabio Quartararo lost I think would be a fair word, Rhys, wouldn't you?
I think so. It just didn't seem to be his weekend, did it? Obviously, he struggled a bit in Portimao, but it was sort of business as usual. He was still pretty clear of Morbidelli. But this weekend, struggling ever since the first practice session, just not seemingly having the pace at all. And then with Morbidelli also being relatively competitive, I just think he was getting frustrated. He couldn't find a good setting. To be fair, the conditions have been a bit dodgy this weekend, so if you couldn't find a base setting you were happy with, you were going to struggle to find one because the conditions were pretty much different session to session. And I almost just think it's just a psychology side of it. Like last year, well, the last like few years, basically since what, like the 90s, everybody that's running Yamaha has said it needs more power. Effectively, that's that's how it's been. But especially like if you're talking four strokes, like even since Rossi got on it in 2004, they said, oh yeah, the bike needs a bit more power, and they finally delivered the power. And Fabio, I think, has just kind of been thinking as soon as he has the power, he will sort of have the performance. And now that that's not true, the power's there, but the performance, especially in Portimao, if we look at that, was very similar to how it was at the end of last year. Although, to be fair, this weekend he wasn't really much worse than he was in Portimao. It's just Morbidelli was better. So Morbidelli was sort of where Fabio was for most of last year to some extent. Maybe not quite that high, but you know what I mean. Like he was up there, top five. So yeah, just I guess he's frustrated because he finally has. Basically, he said to Yamaha, "If you give me more power, I'll win the championship." They gave him more power, and he's not holding up his end of the deal. And I think it's because he's probably just fundamentally misunderstood what the bike needed. It's been mentioned this weekend. It's like, yeah, Dovi kept saying it needed more grip. You know who else kept saying it needed more grip? Rossi said it needed more grip. Vinales said it needed more grip. And I think it's just the fact that it doesn't get that power down to the ground properly. And I think Fabio, he needs to be careful that he's not going to overstress himself too much. He just needs to reset after this round, go to Kota. Again, it's a tricky track for him. And just try and find his form. He had a great race out in 2021, for example, so he can ride well there. So if he can try and reset, have a decent race at Kota, then he's off to Jerez, a track he absolutely loves. So he just needs to try and do a bit of a reset. Clearly, it wasn't working for him this weekend. And you know what? Yes, he's lost a few points there, but as we'll come on to later, Bagnaia didn't exactly have the best weekend either. And you know what? 42 races, you can afford to have two that are a little bit dodgy. I think you'll be okay. We saw how many races did Bagnaia crash out of last year and still win the championship? So
6, I think.
yeah, so it was a tough weekend. Obviously, last weekend was tough for him as well, but this one seemed more so because he couldn't blame the bike because his teammate was beating him. So yeah, it just needs to try and bounce back, I think.
The way I look at it, right, I kind of take a step back into the past. So when we were talking about Frankie, I mentioned very similar style to Rossi. Rossi was always good in Argentina. Very good record there for one of the newer tracks. He was always known for someone that can't teach an old dog new tricks, and he never really liked the new circuits. The Aragon's example, now the Texas, he was never sublime at them tracks. But Argentina was
He
one
was
of those
quite good at
tracks.
Texas, to be fair.
He
Towards the
was, to be
end,
fair,
in
but
19 and 18, he
he
was quite good there.
yeah, okay, maybe not the greatest example, but usually new tracks were never his forte. So for Argentina to be somewhere he won, had many podiums, a couple of second places, very good overall for him. Frankie, very similar style. He probably just suits that kind of track. Argentina, the Port or the Termas de Honda track is designed solely for motorbikes, which is one of the few tracks in the world, believe it or not. So it just probably suits that style a bit more. Fabio has never really liked the place. I remember for many years that it's one of those tracks, along with Aragon, that he never really goes well at. So the fact that he wasn't top three this weekend for me isn't a sign for Lambert. It was just kind of like not really his track. I can't even say the bike is the issue because Frankie obviously put that kind of to rest. But I think, like you said, we need to get to Jerez. We need to get to Le Mans. We need to see what he does on the traditional European tracks. And I think you made a solid point with the Dovi, the Rossi, the Vinales point about they always want more rear grip. And realistically, that's probably what Ducati has. It's what Honda don't have. It's what Aprilia has. It's what KTM didn't have. So it's kind of it. Everyone goes, oh, it's the inline four versus the V4, or it's the top end. But it's actually, if you can't, you can have all the power in the world. If you can't put the power down, you simply will not get to the end of the straight quick enough. And unfortunately, Fabio now has the power, but it just doesn't realize that it's not, can't just keep adding horsepower. It doesn't equal, it's not a linear graph of more power equals better results. It's, you need a, like, just ask Ducati for 15 years. They added more power and power and power, and they went backwards. You need the complete package over the 9 month season. In every single track, you'll have parts where bikes are suited to better parts of the track. And I think Fabio has just got drawn in by the pace of the Ducati alongside him. And I think his slight lack of experience, he is a bit younger, that the fact he thinks it's all about the power. He doesn't realise that the lowering devices Ducati, the aero, their electronic know-how is just what they're better at the moment. Obviously, they have a better engine, but it's a way to get out of the corner and then they get the run. If Yamaha could nail the getting out of the corner like they used for so long under the Rossi, early years of Rossi, the Lorenzo years as well, they were very good out of the corner, made them hard to overtake, even though they weren't the quickest come the last 100 metres. They still managed to win plenty of races back then and many championships. So I think that's where Yamaha now to put a lot of focus in. And imagine if they get rear grip, the bike still turns, they have a bit of rear grip, and they have a solid engine. Jesus, we'll see some serious fireworks then from hopefully both Frankie and Fabio. But I'm going to move on now, as we've spent a lot of time on the Yamaha Duo 2. Unfortunately, the other Japanese manufacturer of Honda, Mir, injured again. Pretty sore looking crashes. He had a small bit of contact in what would be turn 7 or 8, depending on how many you count the straight for. Small bit of contact with Zarco, up into the moon, back down. Concussion, a small contusion on the neck, kind of back area, and a very, very banged up ankle. What is Honda doing wrong, Rhys? Is the $100 million question, you could say.
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sat here on the podcast right now, would I? I'd be earning the big bucks at Honda, but no, it's just I don't know. I think they've just gone the wrong way completely. Like their problems, to be honest, Group Yamaha and Honda together here, their problems go back to like 2015, 2016, like those kind of years. Like the initial years going into the Michelin's development direction was the wrong direction, and they had such an advantage going into that era that they've been competitive even though they've been poor up until recently. Like their advantage going into that era was so large that it's been eaten away, and now they're slowly struggling. Now Yamaha are not in as bad a position as Honda, I don't think. I think their bike is still generally fairly decent at its base, but the Honda just it's not a great bike. They tried to do a massive thing last year, didn't they? And it had all of the same problems as the old bike and got rid of the few strengths that the old bike had. So yeah, I think that's ultimately the problem. They've gone the wrong way of the development direction. Their main rider has been injured for such a long time, and so he's not been able to test. But then during winter, they're using him as a test rider constantly, and they have a test rider, Bradle. You'd almost like say at this point, like they need to get at least another one, because clearly every bike that Bradle's developed has been pretty bad, right? I'm not saying it's Bradle's fault, but ever since they had him as a test rider, they've not exactly come out with a good bike ever. So yeah, I just feel like they've gone down the wrong path. They're just completely lost. They've tried different things to fix what they already have, and I mean it shows. They're getting somebody else to build them like a whole frame, like so. Yeah, it's just they're in a mess. So I don't really know where to start. They've got no rear grip. They've got no front grip. They've got really aggressive bike. The aero is not very good. It's just not much about the bike is good. The only reason probably why it's competitive is, I guess, when you cut it down to its core, the Honda MotoGP bike, I guess, is still a MotoGP bike that's competitive. But it's just with all of the extra stuff that you need nowadays, they're just not getting any of that right.
Yeah, and I'd say they probably have two, maybe three of the best riders out there. You have
Yeah, they've
Marquez,
got a good
obviously,
rider lineup. Like, no disrespect to
best they've had in
Nakagami,
years.
but like the three guys that they've got there, like the Marquez and the two guys they've just got from Suzuki, like literally have been some of the best riders in the last like 10 years. So yeah, it's not the rider lineup.
You've 10 world championships and a serial winner in every class when Rins. So, okay, Nakagami's kind of on the way up, but then you'd imagine they're going to get Ayagora, another guy that you'd imagine will be pretty fast given the right equipment. So, I don't think it's the riders. I think for a couple of years, right, You had Marquez doing the business. You had Danny on the way out of on the downhill part of his career. Then they got Lorenzo, kind of same boat. Cal was always he's kind of like the journeyman rider. He was solid, crashed too often. Openly said he couldn't do what Marquez could do on the bike. Marquez was God, could do what he wanted with the bike, and that's how they kind of won their championships. You mentioned that from the change of electronics and the tires back in 15, 16 era, that they were so far ahead with Yamaha that even though they were losing time to the likes of your Aprilias and when KTM came in and Ducati, that it didn't really make a difference because they were so far ahead that like they could take a step back and they were still basically the kings of the sport along with Yamaha. So there was so much that it kind of the way I look at it is a bit stubborn from Japan. Like the Japanese were always told that the Japanese manufacturers are stubborn. We go back as far as 2003 when Rossi left. They rock up with an RC211V and they go, "You ride that. We don't change the bike. That bike will win if you do your job." To be fair, that kind of stubbornness is what made them great because they made such good bikes. Think back to the NSR 500s. They made such great bikes that the best riders ended up on them because their bikes were so good. They were just renowned for making bikes. Currently in MotoGP, you don't just make a bike and just tell them ride it. You, a bike is like a glove. It has to fit the rider. It has to be comfortable. It has to have everything they need. And unfortunately, they're kind of approaching that with a hammer where they need a kind of scalpel and chisel it. And unfortunately, at the moment, whether it's the test team, whether it's just the feedback they're getting from the riders, which again, from what I have been hearing, all four riders are giving different feedback and are trying to go in four different directions. It's
They've all
never a
got
good
different
sign.
chassis as well, which doesn't help, does it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just it's it's that like you need just the kind of you can have too much riches at some point. You can have too much information. If there's too much noise, you won't get what you need out of it. So Honda for me is going to be very interesting over the next 18 months. The biggest thing for this year is that post Jerez test when they get the Calyx frame. I am so interested in that. That's probably going to be the most interesting thing of the first half of the season to me to see how they go on that because it's the first time they've gotten an outsider to make them a chassis. It's so interesting, but at the same time, I think it's probably not the chassis that's their biggest issue. I reckon the aero is such a big issue that they're going wrong. I reckon if tomorrow we rock up at Mugello, take off all aero, the Honda probably wouldn't be the worst bike. Take off every wing off Ducati, take off them Venturi tunnels, seal up every weird flap they have and stupid aero device. Give them a bike that has two front forks, two wheels, a swing arm, and a shock, and let them go and race and see what happens. I bet that Honda wouldn't be as bad as it looks. I reckon when you start to bolt on everything, like you said yourself, it kind of gets lost and it gets a bit muddy, and that's where they're struggling. But big couple of months coming up for Honda, and unfortunately, Mir now out injured as well. It's really not great timing for them. But we're going to move on now to the GP race. Bezzecchi was rapid in the warm-up. He went out and he said for the first 100 metres he could feel the track had grip and he just went on quicker and quicker and quicker. Carried into the race, didn't he? And he just really was... He did what Anshu should have done, where he was really aggressive to start, quick, got to the front, got the gap, and then just kept it going where other riders, again, Pecco, crashed and made silly mistakes.
Yeah, effectively. That's kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I was saying this is the kind of ride that I think Onshu was trying to do, but just didn't realise that basically you get into a comfortable rhythm by like pushing to a reasonable level and you just pull away because you're just feeling so good and you don't want to slow down. But yeah, Bezzecchi was rapid in warm-up. Obviously they carried that into the race with the wet conditions. But then in the dry the day before, I would argue that he was definitely the quickest guy in the sprint race. Brad Binder obviously won the race. Great start. Aggressive first couple of laps. Pulled a bit of a gap and then defended it. But Bezzecchi got caught up battling Viñales. He got caught up battling Marini. He got caught battling people. Bezzecchi was easily the fastest guy in the sprint race, if you ask me, by like quite a way. I mean, he caught up to Brad at the end and almost beat him. So I think Bezzecchi really ultimately probably deserved to win both races this weekend if you base it on pure pace alone. So as soon as the conditions kind of changed with the rain after qualifying, or sorry, before qualifying even, because the qualifying was wet, basically Bezzecchi was then the fastest guy of the weekend since that. Before that, I think you could say the two Aprilias were. But again, I think he was third behind them before that. So Bezzecchi's has looked good all weekend. and he's been the man to beat really ever since the rain came down and messed the Aprilias up a bit. He's been the man to beat. So fair play. Took the lead early on, commanded the race, built out a huge lead, and just managed it to the end. Great result. It was coming. It was definitely coming. I didn't expect him to win a race in this dominant of a fashion and this early on, but I definitely knew he was going to win a race this year because of just how good he was last year, how good he was at Portimao. You know, the main race, third place. The sprint was a bit of a blip for him, but to be fair, you're only throwing 12 points away if you crash in a sprint, so it's not too bad. At the end of the day, leading the championship now. Bezzecchi, you know, he's going to have a similar season to what Bastianini had last year, I reckon. He's going to be there all season.
Yeah, Bezzecchi was just it was going to happen. Now, I do agree that I didn't expect it to be one, a wet race that he'd do it in, and two, that dominant a fashion. But like when you have the riders like Casey Stoner coming out saying, "Watch over this kid, that he's a bit special," he probably knows that being arguably one of the most naturally talented motorcycle riders of all time, he probably knows what to look out for. And being probably in and around Ducati for the last couple of years, maybe has seen a bit of data and seen what he's like on the bike. Maybe I'm wrong, but I reckon he is just. I'd say he's massive corner speed. He's probably what Ducati have wanted for years, and it's going to be interesting if he keeps up this form because you have the two factory bikes. They're going to have to throw a factory bike into the VR4060 full factory if he keeps up this speed because he's not far behind the other two in terms of Bastianini and Bagnaia. So like you've three rapid Italians on three Ducatis. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how his season goes on. But we're going to move now to someone who had a great race, but unfortunately, Johann Zarco has a huge flaw, and that flaw, Rhys, is his start of his race. Take it away on how his race unfolded.
Well, what I'm about to describe here could be any of Johann Zarco's races. There's been many of them that have been like this. But basically, he qualified fairly decently, about 5th place. Got an okay start, I suppose, but then just started going backwards, just dropping backwards, being overtaken by people. Around about halfway through the race, he then started to claw back some of those people, overtake some people, and by the end, he was massively quicker than everybody else on the track, and on the final lap, took 2nd place in the race. That could be many of his wet weather performances. You know, Le Mans 2021 was like that. The Thailand at the end of the year, last year, was very similar to that. Kind of struggled at the start of the race, and just comes through at the end. He's just so much faster than everybody else. It's like the Maverick Vinales of wet races. Struggles at the starts, and it's just amazing at the end. And again, like, in fairness, had he had that pace the whole time, I guess he would have been able to go with Bezzecchi, but you kind of feel bad for the guy because he got up to 2nd place, and had you not had a runaway leader of Bezzecchi, he wins that race. But because there was one guy that was so far in front of everybody else, it makes him look bad in comparison. But yeah, it just seems to not be able to get it together early on in these wet races. I don't think he really has that much of a problem with it in the dry. Again, I don't think it's his strongest facet, but I don't think he's quite as bad. Obviously, again, it was a similar end of race pace that he had in Portimao. He overtook about 4 people on the last lap, but I don't think he seems to suffer with it quite as much in the dry. But even still, I guess this is just why he's not won a race yet, because he just doesn't have he never has a race where he's the fastest from the start to the finish. And in MotoGP, that's kind of what you need to win if the other guy's not making mistakes.
And usually the weekends where he is probably the quickest from start to finish, he usually ends in the gravel pretty consistently,
pretty
which is pretty much been the story of Johann Zarco's MotoGP career. When he has a chance to win, ends in the gravel. When he's an outside chance to win, he comes hard late on the race and puts on a great charge. And unfortunately, it's just always a bit short of the P1. But good result for him. So hopefully he can. We probably always say this, but hopefully he can build on it, and let's see what he can do going forward. Next, though, KTM. KTM have impressed me a lot this year. A worrying preseason. Strong opening round with 2 riders looking very, very competitive. Of course, we already mentioned Brad Binder winning the sprint race in Argentina. Good in the wet, even though they're lacking development time and just kind of setup time of the engine braking, the mapping and all that. So overall, KTM are on the rise. What do you think?
I actually disagree slightly, in fairness, because I'd say Portimao is more evidence of that than Argentina was, because in Argentina, they were like 50th, 60th, 17th on the grid. That's exactly what we've seen from them the last few years. They can't qualify at all, and the riders are always together on the grid. It's not the riders necessarily. Whereas in Portimao, Miller qualified really high, had a very good start to the sprint race, but not one of those weird starts where he dive bombed like 20 people into the first corner. It was just a normal sort of race start. And then for the regular race, a similar thing happened because he'd qualified well originally. He then was able to go with the leaders just like he'd done in the sprint race. And I don't think the KTM over the last couple of years has necessarily had a race problem at all because they always come through. And you've seen the races where they qualify a bit better or the races where they make a good start, they come through. If you look back to the first round of 2022, Brad Binder second place. In fact, in fairness, in the teams championship, I'm pretty sure they were second place overall at the end of last year because they were there for some rounds. Like they were just really competitive. Another example that pops to my head straight away is Aragon. Binder round the outside at turn 1, overtakes half the grid, gets away with the leaders straight away, and the bike is there. The bike has always been there in the race pace over the last few years. It's a qualifying pace that has not been there. Obviously, again, you said there was 2 riders being strong at Portimao, and again, that was Brad Binder making the difference, having a good start and sort of coming through, or there being a bit of chaos. Again, I think that it was slightly skewed because of Marquez causing some problems at the front, taking out a few riders, perhaps slowing a few people down as well. Obviously, a few riders been missing from the sprint before, so I think that elevated him falsely slightly in some of the positions. And then this weekend, like I said, they qualified nowhere. Binder, again, has an aggressive start to the sprint race and does well there. Then the main race is wet, so again, that kind of takes a lot of stuff out of it. So Miller had an okay race, but Miller's always gone well in the wet. The bike went well in the wet last year. Oliveira won 2 races on it, so I don't really see them being any better than last year. The only sign of positiveness I see that's an improvement is Miller's qualifying in Portimao because their race pace seems the same, their qualifying pace seems the same. So that's my opinion anyway. At least that's so I don't really see them making a step forward except maybe that Miller qualifying lap, but not enough information to make the conclusion yet for me.
I do understand the point you make, and they are a bit skewed. I agree with obviously pre-season at Portimao and then weather affecting today's race weekend, but I still think that they're closer. The fact that, like, the way I look at Binder, you need a solid bike. Even though we talk about that they were good in the races throughout the last couple of years, but they were never good enough to make the starts they've made in the sprint race yesterday. That they were just, he was there like straight away. Now I know that's a bit of rider making a difference, but I still believe that they're overall a bit closer than they have been, and I think with 2 really solid riders that are kind of pushing each other, I think they're a bit closer to the front of the field than we've seen now. Qualifying, still maybe not there. I think Jack is probably better at the one-off lap than I would say his long distance tire management, race management. I think the one-off lap is where he is always excelled. So I'm not too surprised that he's the one that's kind of pulling up 3s with their qualifying, and that Binder still looks like the man on Sunday. But we'll find out more when we get to Texas, a track that's always been a bit quirky, and you can't really bring a form book in there because it just usually goes out. It's usually Marquez, and then something happens behind, and then you kind of just watch and hope to see. But again, like I said, when we get to Jerez, we'll know where really the KTM is at, because you get to a European track, it doesn't have long straights, it doesn't have anything kind of quirky about it. It has your high speed, low speeds, and a bit of everything. So it's a really good track for showing off really who's where and who's what at point of the season. But moving forward to someone who's just not at the races completely, Aprilia. Now, they're banging the drum themselves that they're closer and they're the main competitor to Ducati. Crash for Lace in the sprint race. Both of them struggling in the rain. They started Friday looking absolutely like they were going to walk the race if it carried on in that form, but then they both end up nowhere really in both races. Rhys, what do you think Aprilia are missing at the moment?
It seems like they're just kind of missing maybe the start of the race. They're not quite as good, like maybe getting the tyres activated as the Ducati. That seems to be the Ducati's strength, because we saw that in qualifying, for example, like the track drying. The fastest guys that went onto slicks, they were Ducatis because they could get the heat into the tyres, they could get them to work. So it seems like they're struggling with that in the sprint race. They lost a bit of time from that on the first lap. But also, in fairness, they kind of got stuck battling, especially with Bezecchi. Like Vinales and Bezecchi were going at it. They were like kept overtaking each other, and that allowed some of the other guys to get away. And then Vinales kind of did a bit of a dive that was just never really going to work, and ran himself and Bezecchi both a bit wide. Then Bezecchi sort of made his way through, but at that point, I think the two Aprilia guys had got stuck battling other riders and just got held back a bit. Then Aleix kind of almost reverted to sort of pre 2022 Aleix, where like things weren't quite going well, so he tried to push to make up a bit of time, and he fell off. But everyone has those races every so often. Aleix is not a serial crasher anymore. In the past he kind of has crashed quite out of decent positions or crashed pushing too hard, but you know what? Everyone's allowed to crash every so often, so it's fine. I don't think that's too much of a worry. He was trying to make up time because he'd had a bit of a poor start, lost time battling. So I don't think the sprint race was necessarily. It was a little bit worrying because you've got a sprint race every weekend. People are going to be aggressive every weekend. You're going to get stuck battling every weekend. But it was almost more refreshing to see Vinales being aggressive. So there was actually positives to take from the sprint race. Whereas the main race, there was nothing. Aleix had some issue. I think he had some visor issues by the looks of it. That seems to be a thing that's happening a bit. I guess you get that with a humid track with rain. Obviously, that's not ideal. I don't know if he also had some sort of tyre issue because there was some sort of shots shown after the race and looking behind him, like maybe looking towards his tyre. So I don't know whether he maybe had a bit of a tyre issue. You'll never find out if that's the case because basically the riders and the teams are not allowed to say that. Even if there is a tyre issue, they're just not allowed contractually. In Vinales, well, I don't think he's ever really been the best weather rider. So I think there's mitigating circumstances for everything. But it does seem like getting the tyres actually in the window seems to be a problem for them, which would translate into wet weather because you can't get the heat into the tyres to go straight away. So I think that's probably their biggest problem at the minute. I think the bike is pretty good everywhere else. Also, similarly, I guess to the Yamaha and stuff, it's lacking the actual base acceleration. So the Ducati is difficult for it to pass sometimes, but not impossible. Like it kind of can. It could get the exit. It can make a pass. It's a bit better to pass on than the Yamaha. It's not that bad. So yeah, I think its main problem probably is actually just getting the tyres activated. But then also there was some rider issues this weekend that definitely need to be worked on as well.
Yeah, it's a shame really because we had this building of Aprilia versus Ducati after Portimao, and that the fact that the Aprilias are there, we had Miguel Oliveira being quick, we had the two factories being quick, and then we come here. Friday looks so promising. It looks like Ducati aren't really the ones who are on it this weekend. It looks like Aprilia is the bike to be on. And then unfortunately, as the weekend has gone on, it's swung more to Ducati. Of course, they were rapid, blocked up the front row. There was they were all over the sprint race, they were all over the main race, and Aprilia just faded. And it just shows that again, I think if you look at Ducati, they've been coming after this championship and after the title for so many years. They have that kind of experience, and now they have the equipment and stuff. And I think Aprilia is just shows that they're a little less developed overall as a team. And just sometimes you just see these little moments with Aprilia where it just doesn't click for them. And I think it's just like last year, they did openly say that they just weren't a big enough team to take the opportunities they had. They just hadn't the personnel and the staff and the equipment just to make completely 100% of their opportunities. And unfortunately, it looks like maybe there's still a bit of that in them this year. And possibly, I hate to say this, right, because I like Aleix, but I wonder, have we seen his peak already? Was last year the best of his career? Are we going to see him go downhill? He's really quick this year, and I still think he has a bit to give, but didn't really do much for Portimao, didn't do anything this weekend, and crashed, which he's usually really good at, keeping it rubber side down. So I wonder, is Aleix just slightly over the hill now? And of course, having a slightly quicker teammate. I remember when Vinales went into Aprilia, Aleix really made him look like a lesser rider. And now it looks like Maverick has everything sorted out. Maverick is the main man, and maybe Aprilia have just started to listen to Maverick a bit more, and his direction is taking the bike slightly away from Aleix, and maybe he's losing his team, you could say, a small bit. So it'll be interesting to see now. Again, I'm going to mention it when we get to Jerez. It'll be interesting to see how Aprilia go. Jerez will be a brilliant podcast because we'll find out everything about the whole season.
That's where it rains
yeah,
at Jerez. It's just like wet
exactly,
all weekend
yeah.
and we find nothing out.
2011 all over again. So
Well,
yeah,
we
but
found out
yeah,
Rossi's ambition outweighed his talent that time.
no, oof, big oof. You know. Moving on though to our final rider topic. We've one more after this that's going to be hilarious as always. Alex Marquez is building towards a pretty solid GP rider, wouldn't you say?
I think so. I know that's a bit of a a bad response to that, but yeah, I think so. He seems to be like, I think he was kind of already there. I think the problem was he was not on very good equipment. If you remember back to 2020 when he had all the technicians behind him and stuff, he had some great races. And to be fair, the 2020 Honda probably wasn't as bad as what we've had recently. But either way, his last podium was Aragon 2020. He almost won that race. He also had a great race at Le Mans that year as well in the rain. So obviously, he's a good wet weather rider. He's looked great during pre-season. Obviously, he looked pretty good this weekend. He looked pretty good in Portimao. It didn't quite come together for him the weekend, but the actual race, the main race, he actually did pretty well. He didn't qualify that well, but then some of the people that were in front of him were not taking part in the main race, so he had a few less to overtake, and he had a pretty good race overall. So, yeah, I think he'll just keep getting better because he's got to build that confidence back. Obviously, being on a Honda it just throws you at the road, all the injuries he's had, all the pain. I guess he's got to try and just gain the confidence on it, but he'll keep getting better. He'll just keep finding more things with this bike. So, yeah, I think he probably will be a threat for race wins. A few rounds this year. I don't think he'll probably be one of those guys that's like trying to win every weekend. But I think he'll be solidly there in the top 10 every weekend, and some weekends he'll be fighting for the win on the podium.
Yeah, I reckon he'd be a bit like Zarco, where on his weekends he could be in for a shout of a win and a podium. But I think as I'm gonna say, when we get to Jerez, when the season starts to calm down, your Pecos, your Bastianinis, they'll kind of come to the front. It'll probably level out a bit more. It'll be more of the usual kind of 6, 7 at the front, and then imagine he'll probably fade towards the back of the top 10. But can't take anything away from him. He's got off a dog of a Honda. That's probably his confidence getting off that Honda is probably an all-time low. Getting onto Ducati, he instantly said he had better feeling. He did show promise in initial tests in Valencia. Pre-season went well for him. A lot of people are bigging him up. He's trying to keep everyone's expectations to a certain level, and I think he's doing great, really. And I'm quite happy because he's one of those riders where if he has a bad race or makes a mistake, he's only there because of Marquez or Mark, I should say, and that's just not true. He fair and square won a Moto 3 championship of his own talent. Fair and square won a Moto 2 championship on his own talent. He's had MotoGP podiums when he's had a team behind him. Honda are notorious for not supporting their kind of second teams. We know Cal had issues getting parts as well as Nakagami's not always on the greatest and most up-to-date equipment. So the fact that he kind of got put out in the cold and was told just ride what you have and do what you can wasn't a surprise. That one, he crashed a lot. Two, his roads weren't great. And I'm not really surprised that he got on a really well kind of running Ducati and got a good working, well-oiled team there in Gresini, and he's doing well and showing why he was signed, why he was given another opportunity. He wasn't shipped off to World Superbikes or to somewhere else, or maybe even back down to Moto 2. I still think he has a good future in GP, and I'm really happy for him because he's had to deal with a lot of being the Marquez brother, other than he's his own person, he's his own champion. So I must say I'm happy for him, and I'm really hoping that he does keep up this form and we see more pole positions, front rows, podiums, and maybe a win or two this season would be brilliant for him. It'll be great to see when Mark comes back and they can battle together. That will be a sight to see. But to end off the podcast today, we have to mention some poor stewarding. We talked about it briefly in Portimao. Since Portimao, Marquez's penalty is going to court. It now looks like it might be kind of frozen and not come into play for Texas because it mightn't even get to the courts in time. So that will be a huge win for Honda and for Marc Marquez. Some very questionable decisions this weekend. I feel like the paddock has kind of gone into a bit of a Formula One state where any single thing that happens on track, anywhere that gets run wide, race direction are investigating. I think that we need to leave racing happen. Fair enough, if someone does what Scott Ogden does, penalty, no question, straight answer. But when someone sits up another rider when they go touch wide and they go under and there's no contact, it's just hard fair racing. one, you don't need to look into it. Two, you definitely don't penalise them. Rhys, I'm very interested to see what you made of the stewarding. It's probably one of our like stewarding corners of the podcast for the whole season of last year, and it's good to see we have it again this year.
Well, it's probably not good to see. It'd be better if we didn't
Well,
have to
yeah,
complain about it,
exactly.
I guess. But yeah, like I understand what they're doing. It seems like from the start of this year they've said, right, clean slate for everybody. If you knock somebody else off now, you get a double long lap penalty. And that is the kind of consistency I want to see. Like, I want to see that. Like, I want to see if you've caused a crash, this is X penalty, right? Now, of course, each incident is different. Sometimes things are more egregious, but then that should just be the base. So, like, for example, if you made a bit of a mistake, I think back to Remy Gardner in 2021. I think he went for a move. I can't remember who it was on now, but a move on someone into Caro just completely knocked him off. That's a double on that penalty. Completely fair. He's gone for a move, made a mistake. You know, there's plenty other examples of a similar move. Someone's gone for a pass, made a mistake, or like you say with the Scott Ogden thing, he's made a mistake, had to let the brake off because he's going to fold the front, completely wiped out an innocent rider, double on that penalty. That's just it's almost like the replacement for a ride through now, double on that penalty, because you almost see a ride through as a bit harsh. Like it always for jumping the start, a ride through is a bit harsh. Knocking somebody off, if it's unintentional, which 99.9% of the time, obviously it is. I think a ride through penalty can be a bit harsh because these things do happen, and if you over penalise people, you do end the racing. So I'm all for that consistency. I'm all for set penalty, and then if you take out 2 or 3 people, perhaps you should get more. I think maybe the Marquez one, because he took out a couple of people, probably should get more. But then in the past that would have been a pit lane start. Now it's a double long lap. So yeah, it's tricky because I like the idea of trying to be consistent, but then they weren't even applying these rules consistently because we saw in, obviously, the Moto3 race, we had Sasaki then get a drop 1 position penalty, which, that's almost fine in a way. If you do something that's a bit outrageous, I guess you could get that. But I feel like that's better for a yellow flag overtake penalty, which we also saw used this weekend. I have no problem with that, getting a 1 place position drop for that. But why Sasaki got a penalty for someone running wide? He tried to cut underneath. There was a small amount of contact. The other guy didn't even run off the track or crash. He got a penalty for that. Whereas we had in the MotoGP race basically the identical incident. Vinales tries to go up the inside of Brad Binder. There is a bit of contact. Brad Binder goes down. No penalty for Vinales. Which I feel like maybe that's more right. It's a first lap. There's a little bit of contact. There's 2 lines joined back to one. Maybe it's a racing incident. But you can't give a penalty for one incident and then not for another when they're virtually the same incident. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't think a drop 1 position would have been too bad. Maybe a single long lap. Like, I understand that you've got to say if you knock somebody else off, you get X penalty. But then if you're not even giving out that penalty to people, makes no sense. Then literally, the next corner, Nakagami absolutely sent Quartararo off the track, like, so far. Like, it was, again, Nakagami has got a bit of form for doing these kind of things, where like, it's a really aggressive move. I understand we've wiped the slate clean, so fair enough. Don't, like, add on, for previous. But, like, how can you not give a penalty for that? You give a penalty for contact where nobody even left the track. It makes no sense. Like, I don't know actually if there was quite contact between Nakagami and Quartararo. He might have just lifted up instead, but it was basically pick up or there's going to be contact, which, again, it's not that bad. I'm not saying I think Nakagami should have had a penalty. It was aggressive and it was a bit unfair on Fabio. Perhaps a warning, fair enough for that, would be okay. But it's just when they give one penalty for a collision and then not for another, it just doesn't make sense. And then you mentioned the whole Marc Marquez thing. I think Honda are perfectly within their right to protest that because they issued a penalty saying to be served at the Michelin Argentinian Grand Prix. Marquez doesn't take part in the Michelin Argentinian Grand Prix. Well, that's too bad because you said he's got to take the penalty in this race. He's not at that race, so he shouldn't have to take the penalty. They then said, actually, it's for the next race he competed in, which if they'd listed that originally, I'd be saying that's fair because that makes sense because if he's going to miss a race or whatever, that's just how it should be. It should be put out that's how the penalty should be written every time for every rider, no matter who. But because they've stated this specific race, then tried to change it, I think that must be against the rules or whatever Honda deem it against the rules. And if they get off with it and not have to serve the penalty, then fair enough because it's the steward's mistake and they shouldn't do it. So, yeah, they need to be more consistent. They're trying to be consistent. I can see what they're trying to do. but they're still not even applying their own rules properly. And sometimes they're giving out penalties for things that aren't really penalties. So it's a bit, yeah, it's a bit tricky.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, really, and just again, I agree with majority of your points that they're coming from a consistency side, and I do agree that if you knock a rider off, double on a penalty if you jump a start. I actually think, right, a jump start, once it's not outrageous Lorenzo 2014-esque, a single long lap, because you gain maybe 2 or 3 tenths down into turn one. I don't think a 6 second penalty is fair for that. Now, fair enough, I know you can't leave a penalty there that people go, right, if I jump start, I know I'm going to get a 3 second penalty. I could jump start, make up a load of positions after that, and then kind of take my penalty and kind of get away with it. I know people will try to abuse the rules if it means getting a benefit, but I still think 6 seconds for, like, if it's just a small movement where they've gained nothing, 6 seconds is a lot. Like, passing under the yellow flag for me, drop one position, is a perfect example of the rules being applied right, consistent. It's just, it works. It's the right thing to do. A double long lap penalty for passing under yellow flag, completely outrageous if they went with that. There's
Yeah.
just they need to have a certain playbook that they stick to and are consistent with. And I think as the season goes on, if we keep seeing these Ogden moments and the Marquez moment, and they keep getting double long lap penalties, if they keep getting double long lap penalties for jump starts, but they start to be a bit more lenient with these silly little, oh, well, he just kind of does a small bit of contact and braking, but no rider and crash, they both went to touch wide. That isn't really a penalty. It's a small mistake. No riders out of the race. They lost maybe a second each. The race goes on. It's racing. They don't need to penalise. At the moment, they feel like they're over critical of everything. They're trying to penalise everything. They're trying to be on the ball. They're trying to be edgy, but at the moment, it's just too out of whack. And the whole Marcus situation of him getting out of a penalty, if Honda managed to get him out of a penalty, fair play to Honda and their lawyers. Stewarding, the race direction just need to be more airtight. It's just silly. Like, perfect example is Jenson Button currently has a penalty for the next Formula 1 race he sits. He's been retired since 2016.
Yeah, it was 16 was his actual retirement. Then he stood in one
Yeah.
in 17 and
So
flipped their line at Portier.
exactly. So he still has a penalty, and if he ever comes back, he will get a penalty. Now he's probably not going to come back at this stage, but it's the right thing to do. The riders next race, not the Grand Prix, the Red Bull of Jerez. You can't give it by the name. It's like the cynic in me thinks, well, Marcus saw a penalty for Argentina. I'm not going to Argentina. I'm getting away from that penalty. Now, I know he's broken hand. He probably wouldn't have passed the fitness test. But there's people out there who will believe that he didn't go there because of the penalty like that. And honestly, I'm on the side. I think Honda are going to get him off. I think they will get him out of his penalty. I think that the fact that the race direction have dropped the ball so badly, I do think that he actually won't even serve a penalty for
I think
his
they should.
incident
I think
with.
it just show they need to do it right. Like, I don't think he should get away with the incident because it's bad, but I also think
Nor do I.
yeah, like it should be kind of sorting out the actual stewards. Like, you've made a mistake here. Don't let this happen again.
Yeah, exactly. But I think is that we're going to end it there. Pretty meaty podcast as always. A couple of weeks, I think it's 3 weeks now until we go to the United States of America for the Texas GP. There's going to be more issues there. I can already know the track conditions are going to be a talking point. It was already in my back of my head coming to Argentina. We talk about the track, but thankfully it wasn't as bad as it usually is, and we kind of got away, kind of scot free in terms of track condition.
I think
I
just because
don't
it was
think we'll have
wet
this.
for a lot of the weekend, I don't think it was so much
Yeah,
of
I
an
think
issue.
so too. Um, but in terms of Texas, the bumps now they've apparently done work to it again. But um, if Portimao is going to be anything to go away, just because they've done work doesn't mean they fixed it. So 3 weeks until we are back with round three. But I want to thank you all for tuning in today. If you are listening on the YouTubes, drop a like down below, and if you are tuning in on Spotify, drop us 5 stars. It really helps getting the podcast out into the universe of other podcasts. And just want to say thank you all for tuning in, and we shall see you soon for the next podcast. See you soon.